In the summer of 1965, Sylvia Marie Likens was just 16 years old. The third of 5 children in a struggling family, Sylvia was a bright, kind-hearted teenager who loved roller skating and spending time with her younger sister, Jenny. But this story is not about the simple joys of youth. It is about the unimaginable horror that unfolded behind the closed doors of a small, unassuming home in Indianapolis, Indiana. On the outside, 3850 East New York Street appeared ordinary, no different from the homes that lined the quiet street. But within its walls, an unfathomable nightmare was taking place. At the hands of Gertrude Baniszewski, a woman entrusted to care for Sylvia and Jenny, Sylvia became the victim of a months-long ordeal of torment, humiliation, and violence. It was not just Gertrude but her children and neighborhood friends who took part in acts so brutal, they would scar the community and shock the nation for generations to come. Sylvia was meant to stay with Gertrude for just a few months, a temporary arrangement while her parents worked on the traveling carnival circuit. But what began as a simple boarding arrangement would soon unravel into an escalating nightmare of abuse, fueled by neglect, cruelty, and an almost unimaginable lack of empathy. By October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens was dead. Her body bore over 150 wounds, burns, bruises, and lacerations. The autopsy would reveal she had been systematically starved, dehydrated, and beaten to death. This was no random act of violence. This was a deliberate, prolonged campaign of suffering. And yet, the question remains, how could so many people have allowed it to happen? How could children and adults alike become complicit in such horrors? And why did no one stop it in time? This is the story of Sylvia Likens, a story that forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. It is a story of betrayal, a story of inaction, a story of unimaginable suffering. And it is a story that demands we remember Sylvia, not just as a victim but as a person, a young girl who deserved so much more than the fate she endured. In this documentary, we unravel the events that led to Sylvia's death. We explore the lives of those involved, both the perpetrators and those who failed to intervene. And we confront the legacy of a case that remains one of the most harrowing in American history. This is her story. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949 in Lebanon, Indiana, the third of 5 children in a working-class family. Her parents, Lester and Elizabeth Likens, were no strangers to hardship. The family struggled to make ends meet, and the children were often moved from town to town as their parents worked in traveling carnivals. Despite the instability, Sylvia remained a bright, energetic young girl who found joy in the little things, a love for skating, a fondness for reading, and a deep affection for her younger sister, Jenny. Sylvia was known for her kind heart and outgoing nature, her presence bringing light to every room she entered. She shared a particularly close bond with her younger sister, Jenny, who looked up to her with admiration. The two were inseparable, sharing not just sibling moments but dreams and fears alike. Yet, as much as Sylvia tried to hold on to the joy of childhood, life was never easy for the Likens family. Sylvia and Jenny were used to moving, to the uncertainty that came with their parents' occupation. But things began to take a darker turn in 1965, when their lives would take them to Indianapolis, a place that would become both a refuge and a prison. Gertrude Baniszewski was a woman marked by personal tragedy and hardship. Born in 1928, Gertrude had known her own struggles: unhappy marriages, the loss of loved ones, and a battle with her own mental health. By the time Sylvia and Jenny arrived at her home, Gertrude was a 37-year-old mother of 7 children, living in a rundown house with a deteriorating sense of stability. Though she had been previously married, her second husband, John Baniszewski, had left her, leaving her to fend for herself and her children. Gertrude's life was marred by a history of financial struggle and emotional turmoil. She was described by many as a woman who seemed to carry the weight of her failures, tired, resentful, and bitter. It was against this backdrop that she would become the caretaker of Sylvia and Jenny Likens. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia and Jenny's parents, desperate for work, made an arrangement with Gertrude to take in the girls while they traveled with the carnival. Gertrude was promised $20 per week to care for the 2 sisters, a meager sum that barely covered the cost of food and bills. For Sylvia and Jenny, it seemed like a simple arrangement, a chance to stay with a seemingly kind woman and escape the hardships of life on the road. But beneath Gertrude's outward appearance of motherhood, something darker lay in wait. What began as a simple living arrangement would soon turn into a nightmare. At first, the girls experienced only minor incidents, small punishments that seemed to be nothing more than an overly strict form of discipline. Gertrude, a mother struggling to manage her own children, found herself quickly overwhelmed by the presence of 2 more mouths to feed. But as time passed, the line between discipline and cruelty began to blur. Gertrude's attitude toward Sylvia began to shift. What had once been stern became vindictive. Gertrude began to single Sylvia out, making her the target of her frustrations. Sylvia, for reasons still unclear, became the recipient of an ever-growing list of punishments. She was accused of being dirty, of lying, of stealing, none of it true. And yet, in Gertrude's eyes, Sylvia became a scapegoat, a symbol of everything wrong in her world. The Baniszewski children, caught between loyalty to their mother and the lure of violence, began to follow their mother's example, joining in the abuse. Neighbors would later recall hearing strange sounds from the house: screams, cries for help, the sound of heavy footsteps pacing the floors late into the night. Some ignored it. Others were too frightened to intervene, unsure of what was happening behind those walls. But the real torment was just beginning. Gertrude's cruel treatment would soon escalate far beyond mere punishments. What had started as a form of discipline now evolved into something far darker, something that no one could have predicted. What began as strict rules would soon spiral into unthinkable cruelty, as the very people meant to protect Sylvia would become her greatest tormentors. And no one knew it yet, but the most horrifying part of this story was still to come. Over the course of the summer of 1965, the abuse Sylvia Likens suffered gradually intensified. What started as verbal belittlement transformed into a relentless campaign of psychological and physical torment, a calculated effort to break her spirit. Sylvia was subjected to insults and humiliations that no person should have to endure. Gertrude would call her names, accuse her of being a liar, and make her perform demeaning tasks. But as the weeks passed, the cruelty became more calculated, more methodical. It was almost as if Sylvia had become the target of a sinister game, the stakes being her dignity, her sanity, and ultimately her life. Physical abuse soon followed. First, small things, pinching, hair pulling. Then the beatings would start. Sylvia was struck with belts, wooden spoons, even bare fists. And every time she would flinch or cry out, she would be mocked, forced to apologize for her outbursts. Gertrude's own children participated, often acting under their mother's direct commands. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect was how the abuse became a routine. Gertrude seemed to take a perverse pleasure in watching Sylvia suffer, toying with her sense of fear and vulnerability. And what was even more heartbreaking was that Sylvia's own younger sister, Jenny, was coerced into participating. Jenny was often forced to watch and sometimes participate. She was told it was her duty, her responsibility to make things right in the house. It was a cruel manipulation, a way to isolate and control Sylvia even further. Despite the escalating nature of the abuse, the people around the Baniszewski house seemed largely unaware or unwilling to get involved. Neighbors who lived just feet away heard the screams and cries, but most chose to stay silent. To many, it was as if Sylvia's suffering was taking place behind an invisible veil. There were moments when Sylvia's cries could be heard by the people nearby. Some heard her screams late at night, others saw her stumbling in the yard, covered in bruises. Yet, many chose to turn a blind eye, assuming it was simply the behavior of children fighting, or they feared to get involved. It was a tragic silence, a collective disregard that allowed the abuse to continue. For months, Sylvia's suffering went unnoticed by the world outside the house. As the weeks passed, Sylvia's condition deteriorated rapidly. She was subjected to a series of increasingly brutal acts: burns, lacerations, and repeated assaults. And yet, in the midst of this unfathomable suffering, Sylvia clung to a thread of hope. Even as her body became a canvas for the most unimaginable pain, Sylvia fought to hold on. She would try to speak, to explain herself, but her voice was drowned by the unceasing tide of cruelty. The physical toll was profound. Her body bore over 150 wounds, burns, bruises, and deep, lacerated marks, all of which were a testament to the unimaginable torment she endured. Her final days were filled with pain, hunger, and the slow draining away of life. Despite all the suffering, Sylvia held on to a quiet dignity. She would wince but never beg. She would endure the agony in silence, holding on to her own sense of self until the very end. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia's suffering would come to an end, but not without leaving behind evidence of the brutality she had faced. When police discovered her unconscious body, they were confronted with one of the most disturbing crime scenes in recent memory. The official investigation began almost immediately. Witnesses were interviewed, physical evidence was collected, and a picture began to emerge of what had really happened. Shocking revelations came to light as the testimonies unfolded. Witnesses recalled witnessing Gertrude's children participating in acts of violence. But the real key to the investigation lay in the testimonies of those who were too afraid to speak up. Gertrude herself was questioned. Her responses were laced with excuses and attempts to deflect blame. Yet, no matter how she tried to present the situation as an act of discipline gone wrong, the truth was undeniable. For Sylvia Likens, there was no escape. On May 1, 1966, the trial of Gertrude Baniszewski began, drawing national attention. What had once been a horrifying, isolated tragedy was now being laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom became the battleground for the fate of those responsible for Sylvia Likens' suffering. Gertrude's defense strategy was clear: to shift blame, to paint herself as the victim, and to deflect responsibility for her actions. Gertrude's defense team argued that she had acted out of frustration and that she had not intended to kill Sylvia. They described her as a woman overwhelmed by the stresses of life, financial trouble, emotional strain, and raising a large family on her own. But this argument did little to explain the systematic, brutal torture Sylvia endured. As the trial progressed, Gertrude's children took the stand. Each one had a different perspective on what happened in the Baniszewski home, but their testimonies revealed a shocking truth. The cruelty they witnessed was not only tolerated but encouraged. The children described how they were told to punish Sylvia, how they saw her starved, beaten, and humiliated. The most harrowing of these accounts came from the children, who admitted that they too had taken part in the abuse. One of them even confessed to burning Sylvia with a cigarette. Yet, despite their direct involvement, Gertrude's defense managed to create a narrative in which her role was downplayed, as if she were merely an overwhelmed mother. As the trial continued, the prosecution presented a clear case. Sylvia Likens had been tortured, physically, mentally, and emotionally, by the people who were supposed to care for her. They painted a portrait of a girl who was not just a victim of abuse but a victim of an entire system that failed to intervene. The defense had a harder time justifying their client's actions when faced with the overwhelming evidence of Sylvia's injuries. On May 19, 1966, after weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The verdict was in. Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder. Her children, though initially facing serious charges, would later be sentenced to varying terms in juvenile detention. Some would serve only a few years before being released. Gertrude Baniszewski was sentenced to life in prison. Yet even this sentence seemed inadequate in light of the horrific acts she had committed. Her children's sentences were lesser, and the question lingered: should they have faced greater consequences for their roles in Sylvia's death? The courtroom buzzed with mixed reactions to the sentences. Some felt justice had been served. Others were left to wonder if the punishment truly fit the crime. The trial of Gertrude Baniszewski gripped the nation. Newspapers reported on the case extensively, with sensational headlines and graphic details. The public was appalled, not just by the nature of Sylvia's suffering but by how such cruelty could go unnoticed for so long. For many, this case brought the issue of child abuse into the national spotlight in a way that had never happened before. It forced society to confront the uncomfortable truth that abuse could take place in a quiet suburban home behind closed doors, where no one would dare to intervene. The case became a turning point in how child abuse was viewed in America. The question on everyone's mind was, how could no one have stepped in? The court of public opinion was harsh, and public outrage over the cruelty Sylvia endured sparked calls for better child protection laws. It became a symbol of how an entire community can turn a blind eye, and how the system failed her. The case of Sylvia Likens didn't end with the trial. It left a scar on the heart of the nation, a reminder of the price of inaction. Her family, particularly her sister Jenny, had to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of such unimaginable loss. For Jenny, the burden of witnessing Sylvia's suffering haunted her long after the trial ended. Jenny, though devastated, would go on to speak about the case for years, trying to bring awareness to the issue of child abuse and the importance of speaking out when something is wrong. She, too, had been a victim of Gertrude's manipulation, but her recovery was a testament to her strength. Today, Sylvia's story continues to resonate. It serves as a stark reminder of how easily we can turn a blind eye to suffering, how easily we forget that there are voices that need to be heard. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there a moment when someone could have stepped in and saved Sylvia? And what lessons can we, as a society, learn from Sylvia Likens' story? Can we protect our children better now, or are we still too afraid to intervene when we see something wrong? Sylvia's life was tragically cut short, but her story lives on, urging us to reflect on our responsibilities to each other, especially to those who cannot protect themselves. It is up to all of us to ensure that no child is ever left to suffer in silence again. Sylvia Likens was more than just the tragic victim of unimaginable abuse. She was a young girl, full of life and promise, who had dreams, hopes, and a future that was stolen from her far too soon. Despite the horror she endured, Sylvia's story has become a rallying cry, a call for justice, for reform, and for change. Her name will forever be associated with the fight against child abuse, a legacy that cannot and should not be forgotten. Sylvia's story is not just one of pain, it is also a story of immense strength. Despite the unrelenting torment, Sylvia displayed an unimaginable amount of resilience. She fought for her survival every day, even as her body and spirit were slowly worn down. And yet, in the face of such cruelty, she never lost the flicker of her humanity. The hope, the life, the spirit of a young girl who deserved love and protection. These were things Sylvia clung to even in her final moments. Sylvia's innocence, her ability to love despite the cruelty around her, is a testament to the beauty that existed within her. She never deserved the fate that befell her. And yet, her story has transcended the unimaginable suffering she faced, becoming a beacon for change. Sylvia has given a voice to so many others who, like her, suffer in silence, trapped in environments of abuse with no way out. Her legacy is now woven into the fabric of child advocacy and protection efforts around the world. Sylvia's story has ignited movements, inspired legislation, and brought awareness to a devastating issue that affects millions of children each year. But this is not enough. The truth is, there are still children suffering in silence, still families where abuse is rampant, still communities where people turn a blind eye. This cannot continue. It is up to each and every one of us to take a stand. If you suspect a child is being abused, don't ignore it. If you see the signs of neglect, don't look away. Call the authorities, reach out to child protection services, and be the voice that child cannot yet speak for themselves. The resources are out there, organizations that provide immediate help, support, and hope for children trapped in abusive situations. Your action could save a life. Sylvia Likens' life was tragically short, but the story of what she endured and the lessons we can learn from it are eternal. Through her, we are reminded that each child is precious, each life is invaluable, and each act of cruelty must never be tolerated. Sylvia's story will continue to inspire generations to come, but her memory is also a call to action. To protect the innocent. To speak up. To fight for those who can't fight for themselves. May we all do our part to ensure that no child ever faces what Sylvia did. May we never forget her story, and may we always stand for justice for the most vulnerable among us. If Sylvia's story moved you, stay tuned for our next episode, a deep dive into another haunting case of betrayal and resilience. A story where the very people who were supposed to protect a child instead became the harbingers of their darkest days. Next time, we unravel the chilling tale of a young girl who suffered unimaginable torment at the hands of those she trusted most. A case that shocked the nation, and left everyone questioning how far a person can be pushed before their very humanity is shattered. Stay with us as we explore the hidden darkness behind the facade of normalcy, uncovering secrets that will leave you speechless. What happens when the people closest to you betray you in ways no one could ever imagine? Don't miss it. The next chapter is coming soon. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you won't miss a moment of the story. Until next time, stay aware. Stay vigilant. Stay compassionate. What are your reflections on Sylvia's story? After hearing about the unimaginable cruelty she endured and the aftermath that followed, do you believe justice was truly served? Was the punishment for those responsible enough to hold them accountable for what they did to this innocent child? We want to hear from you. How does Sylvia's story make you feel? Do you believe that enough is being done to protect children today from similar fates? Or do we still have a long way to go? Your thoughts and voices are powerful. If you feel moved by Sylvia's story and want to continue this conversation, share your reflections with us below in the comments. What lessons can we take from this? How can we prevent tragedies like this from happening again? If you haven't already, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with your friends and family. By sharing, you're helping to spread awareness about the importance of protecting vulnerable children. Together, we can ensure that Sylvia's legacy of resilience and justice is never forgotten. Sylvia Likens may have lost her life in the most tragic of ways, but her story lives on, through those who fight for justice, through those who stand up for the vulnerable, and through every life that is touched by her memory. May we honor her by never forgetting what happened, and by doing everything we can to prevent it from happening again. Until next time, remember, justice doesn't stop at the courtroom. It lives in each of us, every day,